All right, so we have Dr. Nelson here, so thank you very much for being here today. So I guess to start out, you recently said in an interview that the internet as it stands right now is kind of in its adolescent phase. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, we keep thinking that the internet's a mature technology. We've had it around for 10, 15 years, and it just seems like it's been here, we're so used to it. The assumption is that it's mature. But really, we're still looking at another 5 or 10-fold increase in the speed of the internet, in the capacity for new innovations, and the number of innovations, the number of applications is going to increase by 50 or 100 times in the next 10 years. So really the internet it's like an unruly 12-year-old. It's just starting to define itself. There's a lot of new development coming, and if we make the wrong choices, we could really shut down the development of the internet, and we could limit all the great new innovations that could happen. So this is a critical phase in the development of the internet. We've got about 3 or 4 years to make the right decisions so that the internet continues to be open to new content, new innovation, new applications. Unfortunately, there are a number of people who would like to restrict the internet, control what content is developed on it, what kind of applications are used. And so there's going to be a tug-of-war, a rather ferocious tug-of-war over the next 3 or 4 years to determine whether the internet continues to be a platform for innovation and creativity.
Would that restriction be what you consider the wrong path?
That's one of the many ways in which we could go off course. And as I said, there are lots of forces that would like to control and limit the net, from the censors in China to some of the people who are trying to impose overly restrictive controls on copyrighted content, to some of the intelligence services and Homeland Security people who are very concerned about misuse of the internet for crime and criminal activity. We're all against crime and criminal activity, but we're not against controls that would eliminate a lot of legitimate purposes for the internet.
Maybe you can get into a little bit who exactly controls these decisions. Like who exactly would be making these decisions in terms of the internet? And
well, that's the genius of the internet. No one's in control, and everyone's in control. There is no centralized point of control for the internet. It's not like the telephone networks, which were typically controlled by 1 or 2 large telephone companies in their country. It's not like the radio spectrum, which is controlled by governments and which is carefully licensed to a few hundred owners of radio stations. The internet really has a very low barrier to entry, which means that there are hundreds of thousands of sub-networks that make up the global internet. They're all running the same protocol, they all speak the same language, they all interconnect. And as a result, there's no single focal point. There's no place where somebody can click a switch and turn off the internet.
Absolutely. All right, so in a recent interview, you also talked about the new internet protocol, or the possible, and I think you referred to it as IPv6. Can you just explain that a little bit more in terms of what that is, or what would be or should be?
Well, when the internet was developing, the assumption was that this was a research network and that a few million people would use it. So back in the early 80s, they developed IPv4, which is Internet Protocol version 4. And when they were doing that, they had a choice to make. How many numbers would they allocate for different devices on the internet? With IPv4, that number was a little over 4 billion. And at the time, they thought, well, this is ridiculous. Why would we ever need 4 billion numbers or addresses for devices on the net? But they played it safe. They allocated 4 billion. Well, we're about to use up all of those numbers. In the next few months, we're going to run out of these numbers, which are critical for defining who's on the internet and where they are. So because we could see this problem developing, 15 years ago, work was started on Internet Protocol version 6, IPv6 for short. Mm-hmm. That standard was developed about 10 years ago, and since then, companies like Cisco and large computer companies, software companies, have all been incorporating IPv6 into their hardware and into their software. So we have the technology to move to this new addressing scheme, which would actually allow for more than 1 trillion IP addresses. So each of us will have more addresses. Each person using the internet today will have far more addresses than are available on the entire internet today. And companies are moving to IPv6, And particularly now that we've run out of the old IPv4 addresses, that it's critical. But there were a lot of choices being made 10 and 15 years ago when we defined what IPv6 would be. And one of the choices was whether we would continue to have anonymity in cyberspace. With IPv4, you could do what you want and be anonymous. You wouldn't leave a trace that could be tracked back to your computer and to your person. There were proposals when IPv6 was being developed to eliminate that anonymity and to link every packet that got sent to the machine that was sending it. And that would have made it much more easy for dictators, for police, for anybody to track back and see where an anonymous message came from. So it would have eliminated some of the uses of the net, like what dissidents in Burma were doing to share videos when the riot police were beating and killing Buddhist monks. That kind of capability just wouldn't be there, because it would be so easy to find out, okay, where did this packet come from, who sent this video, what cell phone did they use, or what laptop did they use. And so that was one decision that allowed us to continue to have this open internet. But there are many more decisions coming that will define what we can do with the internet. We have decisions about cloud computing, we have decisions to be made about the new broadband wireless technologies. There are many places where people are going to argue about how much control should be built into the software and the hardware. So far, the internet ethos has been to let everybody have control, but there is this tug of war.
Absolutely. Who exactly is controlling the programming, or the who exactly is controlling IPv6?
Well, there's many different layers. IPv6 is defined by the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is really a pure meritocracy. It's about 2,000 or 3,000 internet engineers from all around the world, and they come together every 4 months to agree on the fundamental standards for moving bits across the internet. And the IETF standards have really defined what the internet is. They are the ones who created IPv4, and now they've created IPv6. Not only do they define the standards, they also promote them. So the engineers who develop these new applications and technologies go back to their home companies or their governments, and they help spread word of these new developments that will allow even greater capability, even better security, even better reliability on the internet. So they kind of define the bottom layer of the internet, but they don't control it. They pull rather than push. So they provide people with exciting new applications, and the market is pulled towards them. But they don't have the ability to push and demand or control. At the end, the marketplace decides. The vendors who are developing the technology will decide whether a new application is worthwhile and whether they think the market will accept it. If they don't, then maybe some new startup will take the technology and turn it into a new product that people will want. So at the end of the day, it really is everyone in control, everyone making decisions about the services they want. But that's the internet layer, that's the network layer. Above that, we have the domain name system. And that is partly defined by the Internet Engineering Task Force, but it's controlled and managed by ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. They are the people who make sure that there's only one georgetown.edu. They're the people who make sure that IP addresses are properly allocated so that 3 people don't end up with the same IP address and start getting each other's email. That would be a rather unfortunate thing. And they do a lot of work to promote better security, better practices. They work with all of the companies that sell domain names to coordinate that process. And they also work with the registrars and the groups like ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers, which allocates these IP addresses, which are really so fundamental. They're like the house address that each of us has on our house. And then above that, you have the web, which is one of the many things that makes the internet so useful. Web standards are set by the World Wide Web Consortium, several dozen companies and hundreds of individuals who come together to write the rules for the web. And again, they don't push, they don't command. They provide these great new technologies, and Microsoft, Firefox, Mozilla, Google, they have to decide whether to use these web technologies in their browser and in the other web tools that are developed. And then, of course, above that, we have all the web content, all the great new applications like Facebook and Twitter, and those are all defined by their individual companies, who at the end of the day are only going to be profitable and successful if they're doing something that people want. So it's a competitive, very Darwinian kind of system, which has served the internet incredibly well so far. And again, there's a lot of tug and pull, lots of companies trying to take more control, trying to limit what other people can do, and so far they've been unsuccessful because the barrier to entry for the internet is so low. Both the barrier to getting connected or creating a new network is so low, and the barrier for creating a new application or new technology is so low that there's going to be robust competition for a long time to come.
Absolutely. Returning to the anonymity issue, you mentioned that like along with IPv6 there's like proposals or some kind of push and pull to get to be able to like track back like every single one of your movements to every single IP address. Would a single company be able to do that? Would that be like an application, or would that be like fundamentally like inherent part of like the lowest level of the internet?
Well, with IPv6 it would have been built in. With other services like wireless broadband, it may be one company's service that has some tracking feature built in, and in some countries they're doing that because they want to make sure they know exactly who's got what cell phone. In many of these countries you can't get a cell phone unless you come in and you show a passport and you register, and at that point the authorities are going to be able to associate those bits coming from that cell phone, that SIM card, with an individual. Some cases people are bringing in cell phones and smartphones from other countries. They're bypassing that. But it's not just China. This is in many countries around the world have this kind of procedure where they want to know who's sending what bits from what cell phone. But on the other hand, we do have internet cafes. We have a lot of different places that people can go to upload video and upload files and things that and do it in a way that's pretty anonymous. Although in some countries they have cameras at every internet cafe, they monitor who comes into the front door. They really are. They're really trying to crack down. They're trying to keep a lid on. Not succeeding, but they're trying.
Cool. I guess next I want to touch on some case studies in terms of what we're doing with the design seminar and the case study that this interview is kind of going towards is the WikiLeaks case.
Right.
So it's the WikiLeaks case, and I also want to touch on Egypt and the role of the internet there. So I guess let's start with Egypt in terms of people being able to upload videos and stuff like that. In Egypt, as we know, the government was able to shut down the internet. Talk a little bit about the technological challenges or abilities. Like how exactly were they able to shut down the internet in their own country?
Well, in Egypt, there is a central point of control because the internet is built upon the old telephone network structure. And there's a single building in downtown Cairo where all of the wires and cables that connect all of Egypt to the outside world come through. And so there's only about 15 different internet service providers in Egypt, and they all rely on the same international network connections. And so the government was able to say to all of those companies, shut down your service or we're going to come in and we're just going to cut the cable and you're not going to be able to get your bits to the rest of the world. And that was adequate pressure. At the end of the day, they cut off all the networks except the one that served the Egyptian stock market, because they knew that was a priority just to keep the economy going. There are other ways to do this. There are other less coercive ways to restrict the flow of bits in and out of the country. In many countries, they do block certain websites, and so they're able to have a blacklist of sites that users can't get to. In other countries, they slow down service to certain websites just to make sure people are so frustrated they never go to those sites. So they can say, well, we're not blocking it, they're just making it unusable. But in Egypt, we did see a very extraordinary case, because that's not happened before, where countries have, in Burma they did close down most international internet connections. But in Egypt, it was such a high-profile case because you have a country of more than 40 million people, tens of millions of people using the internet. They have very high, rather high penetration, about 30% penetration of the internet. And so when they cut down the internet, I think they shot themselves in the foot, because they made people really angry. And people didn't stay at home and just blog about Mubarak and how mad they were. Now they had nothing to do at home, so they got out in the streets. Or if they were at home and they stayed at home, they turned on the television and started watching Al Jazeera, which is, I think, at least as important in the equation in Egypt. And certainly, we call it a Twitter revolution, but less than 1% of the population of Egypt were using Twitter. More than 50% of the people were watching Al Jazeera. So if we want to call it anything, we might want to call it an Al Jazeera revolution.
Excellent. Explain the, I guess, is such a shutdown possible in the United States?
Well, in the U.S., we don't have such a centralized system. We've built specialized networks just for data traffic. You don't have a single building or even 20 buildings where you could go and turn off the power and unplug the cables and cut us off from the rest of the world. And there are many, many more internet service providers that are providing some part of internet connection in the U.S. It would be possible to try to isolate us from the rest of the world, because there aren't that many places where we connect to the rest of the world. Although, with all the links to Canada, there's a lot of places you'd have to go. It would be almost impossible to cut down all internet traffic inside the country. Georgetown runs its own network. All these different institutions run their own network, and in order to turn off those networks, you would have to have leverage over each one of them. And I just don't see how that would come to be.
Okay, cool. I guess switching gears a little bit to the WikiLeaks case, I guess explain your stance on WikiLeaks itself. Is it a good thing or bad thing? Are you for it or against it?
Well, I think what I'm very much in favor of is the new spin-offs of WikiLeaks.
Like
There's something called OpenLeaks, there's the Al Jazeera Transparency Initiative, there's IndoLeaks, Brussels Leaks. There's a number of groups that have formed these anonymous Dropboxes online where someone can take interesting information, might expose corruption, might expose government hypocrisy, might expose corporate malfeasance, and they can anonymously leave those documents, and no trace of who did it will be recorded.
Is there any chance you could explain a little bit the technology behind the anonymous Dropbox, or is that not your?
Well, it's not all that difficult to do this. There's lots of different ways to do it. One of the oldest ways was to send the bits through several different anonymous remailers. So you send something to a remailer, it takes the packet, strips off the return address that was on the packet, puts a new return address on it, sends it along to another anonymous remailer. It does the same thing. So eventually you've gone through 3 or 4 of these anonymous remailers, and at each point you've taken off any evidence of where it came from. And so there's a typical internet packet will go through 5 or 6 different routers anyway. So if you send it to 5 or 6 different anonymous remailers, it's very easy to do, and again, there's no way to track back. The only thing that would be evident at the receiving end was that the packet had come from an anonymous remailer, and if you went there, you wouldn't be able to find who had sent it from there. So that's one way that's very effective. But at the end of the day, often it's possible to track back and find out who had access to that data. So in the WikiLeaks case, which shouldn't be called the WikiLeaks case, it should be called the Bradley Manning case, although it hasn't been proven in court that he was responsible. He was the only person who had access to all this stuff, who was downloading all this stuff. And so at the end of the day, by looking at the logs, they were able to determine, I guess, where where the leak was. The astonishing thing was that the DoD was so inept in how they were managing this classified database. The fact that they didn't notice that somebody was downloading hundreds of thousands of documents. There should have been alarm bells going on after he downloaded the first 1,000. So it's quite extraordinary that this happened. But it will happen again in the future. And maybe in the future it won't be some low-level private who's an analyst who's supposed to just download and look at the documents. It might be somebody who actually runs the system, who will have higher level access and who will be able to pull off documents in ways that Manning couldn't have done, and do it much more quickly. So there's a lot of possibilities now, because again, the barrier to entry has been lowered. It used to be so complicated to be a spy and dangerous. You had to expose yourself. You had to go out and actually meet with somebody, or at least talk to them on the telephone, or your phone conversation could be wiretapped. And now, with these technologies, anybody who is convinced that they're on a mission to save the world or expose corruption or get back at their employer, they have the ways to do it. We had this case with WikiLeaks in Switzerland, where a disgruntled executive took thousands of records of very wealthy bank customers at a Swiss bank. Apparently these were all people who were clients of the bank and were hiding some money overseas so they didn't have to pay taxes. And he was able to take that and just put it out to the world. So we'll continue seeing these cases. I think that the problem I have with WikiLeaks is in some cases they were quite irresponsible. I mean, that they were exposing people who were doing the right thing, people who were trying to fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and rather than blacking out their names and exposing the process without exposing the people. WikiLeaks has improved in that regard, but OpenLeaks has made a commitment to work with newspapers, work with the media to try to avoid people who are trying to malign somebody using fictitious information, or try to protect people who, in the case of these people fighting the Taliban, were doing the right thing. We're actually trying to help their neighbors. So it's a interesting new phenomenon. It's not stoppable. It's certainly going to happen. The other thing that I can say, I like to quote Mika Sifry, who's one of the founders of the Personal Democracy Forum. And he says he doesn't think he's pro-WikiLeaks, but he knows that he is anti-WikiLeaks. So I think the people who want to attack WikiLeaks and close them down and limit their use of MasterCard and unplug their internet service provider and their cloud service provider, those people are overreacting, and the kind of action they're taking will be used by repressive governments all around the world to justify extreme actions against dissidents. Because they can just say, look, the U.S. got upset with WikiLeaks. Look what they did with Julian Assange. They went and unplugged him. They went and cut off his money supply. We're going to do the same thing to our dissidents.
So, you got into it. Obviously, it's a big topic. But what do you see as some of the major implications of WikiLeaks? Obviously with the Afghanistan war cables, and you recently had the diplomatic cables released. And so what are the implications for governments and maybe and for corporations?
Well, I'm doing a paper on confidentiality, privacy, and transparency in the age of WikiLeaks. The first reaction when the news stories came out about WikiLeaks, and particularly about the rumors that WikiLeaks had a laptop full of confidential bank memos from some large American bank, the first reaction was, oh my God, make sure that doesn't happen to our company or our organization. Let's lock everything down. But then people thought about it, and they realized that that really didn't work. There are a couple important lessons from WikiLeaks. One of them is that if you have 500,000 people with access to these confidential memos, that it's going to be very hard to secure them any way you try. At the end of the day, people can take pictures off the screen and capture things. So you have to ask yourself instead, what's really vital? What do we really have to protect? And the converse is, what should we be making available? What confidential information is so useful to so many people that we should find a way to make it available? At the end of the day, I think the WikiLeaks fiasco may be a positive benefit for the U.S., particularly if it leads to more truth-telling, more groups like OpenLeaks exposing unethical, corrupt behavior in countries around the world. The other more immediate benefit, though, is that now there's better understanding about why the U.S. is pursuing certain foreign policy objectives. In Iran, the president was on national television saying that WikiLeaks was all a fabrication. This was all made up. It was all a plot by the U.S. government because he was upset that there were all these cables that were exposed that said that the U.S. ambassadors in countries all around the Middle East were meeting with the leadership of countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, and time after time these countries were saying, these guys in Iran, they're crazy. We can't stand them. You must pen them in, stop them. And the president of Iran said, well, this isn't true. Our brothers, our Arab brothers love us. This is all just fabrication. This is all part of disinformation, propaganda. But it wasn't. Now, it put the leaders of these countries in the Middle East in an awkward position, but the truth is it's probably better for the world that everybody understands that Iran's neighbors are quite unhappy with the behavior that they're seeing and very concerned about the threat of a nuclear bomb in the hands of Ahmadinejad.
Absolutely. All right, kind of starting to close, starting to wrap it up a bit. I guess, how tenuous is the nature of the internet in terms of, in terms of being able to, in terms of it being able to retain some kind of anonymity on the internet, and I guess like is it is there like a thin layer of like 1,000 or 2,000 people who have like a fundamental control over the internet, over the internet, like how tenuous is the nature of the internet, how much does it take to fundamentally switch the to put on the wrong path in your words as opposed to setting on the right path?
Well, I think it would take 20 or 30 major governments to take action that require certain things of all internet service providers. And it could be that they would somehow add an extra identity layer on the internet and make sure that every bit that gets sent has a return address. The good news is that most of the equipment that's in the internet today doesn't support that, and there would be a lot of costs, and there would be a lot of pieces of the internet that would not have that added in. I think a bigger concern is that a few companies like Google, Yahoo, Hotmail, they might be pressured to reveal information about their users. And so rather than attacking identity at the network layer, they would instead try to capture the content that people were sharing at the application layer. They would not be able to catch everything, and people would use services like Tor, T-O-R, or some of the other anonymity enhancing technologies to hide what they're doing. And thousands of dissidents around the world are very effectively using that technology.
Absolutely.
But for the average person, it's quite easy to learn about everything they're doing online if you can get access to their account. The Chinese apparently have been very adept at hacking into the email accounts of dissidents, both in China and around the world. And some very disturbing reports about GhostNet and other efforts. So it would be more like termites than a total a fire or something that would burn the house down. But you could see losing control here and there, losing user control, losing anonymity bit by bit, and that's what I really worry about, because when you have a termite problem, you don't always notice it right away, and it can happen year by year, and always for the best intentions. We have to fight child pornography. We must stop money laundering. We got to know what Al-Qaeda is doing online. All these reasons for trying to control and track everything that goes on the internet. But at the end of the day, I think we benefit so much more by having an open internet and having the ability to have open exchange. Once you start censoring, it's a very slippery slope. And it's also very dangerous, because once the word goes out that the internet is censored, and that you can't get everything you want, it becomes very easy for the real crazies to argue, whether the extremist Islamists or the violent neo-Nazis or skinheads. If there is some sense that the government is holding these people back and holding us down, that becomes like forbidden fruit. And oh, they must be dangerous. They must have the right answer. Government's trying to control them. That's the kind of thing we have to avoid. The only answer to bad information, malicious, hate-filled speech, is better speech. More of it, correcting the misinterpretations of reality that these people are trying to share.
That's about it for my part. Thank you very, very much for your time today,
Okay.
and you've provided some great insight into these things. So thank you very much for your time.
Glad to do it.